Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Biology Podcasts. This podcast is on photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is an anabolic process, where cell respiration was catabolic, meaning molecules are broken down. Photosynthesis is anabolic, meaning molecules are combined. And in particular, we're combining carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis is carbon dioxide requiring process. It uses light energy in the form of photons. It uses water, and it produces organic macromolecules, and in particular glucose. Direct your attention to this formula. This is the formula for photosynthesis. Pay attention to the arrow because the photons in the sun are needed in order to produce glucose, and oxygen is given off as waste. So let's look at light absorption first of all in chloroplasts, because chloroplasts are responsible for photosynthesis. What they do is they absorb light energy from the sun, and they do that in a process called the light-dependent reactions, and we are going to talk about light-dependent reactions later. Now, photosynthetic cells may have thousands of chloroplasts. So, for example, this particular plant cell here, all of these sort of little green circles are chloroplasts. And you can see that in one cell, there's lots and lots of chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are a double membrane organelle. They're very similar to the mitochondria, and in fact there's some evidence that would suggest that chloroplasts and mitochondria sort of came about at the same time, evolutionarily speaking. So they have an inner membrane, the chloroplast, except this time it's folded into disc-shaped sacs called thylakoids. So this is a thylakoid right here. Now, on the thylakoid, we find chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is a photosynthetic pigment. We also find other pigments called accessory pigments. And thylakoids are arranged in stacks called grana. Now, the grana are connected to each other, and they're all surrounded by a gel-like material called the stroma. And light-capturing pigments are organized into what's called photosystems. Now, if we compare this to, say, a mitochondria, you can see that structurally the chloroplast is very similar to the mitochondria, and this is why we suggest that very similar relationship between them. So let's look a little bit at pigments. First of all, light, as we know, travels in waves. It also travels in packets called photons. So if we look at sunlight, which is also known as white light, sunlight's made of different wavelengths, and that carries different amounts of energy. And this is sort of the electromagnetic spectrum. And what we're concerned about is right here, in this range here, and that's between 400 and 700 nanometers. This is called the visible spectrum, and this is where photosynthesis works within plants. So when light strikes an object, it is absorbed, transmitted, or reflected, and this is important to understand because if we look at plants, plants reflect green light. They absorb the other colors, but they reflect green back, and that's why the chlorophyll, and that's why plants appear green. When all colors are absorbed, the object will appear black, and when all colors are reflected, the object appears white. This diagram here is very useful to sort of show what we mean by absorbed, what we mean by reflected, and what we mean by transmitted. So pigments and chloroplasts. Within the thylakoid, there's a variety of pigments, or colors. We have greens, reds, oranges, and yellows. The most common is chlorophyll, and there's in fact two types of chlorophyll that are the most common. We have chlorophyll A and we have chlorophyll B. Now this is a separation of pigments done on paper chromatography. And you can see that with some solutions, the pigments will separate out. And so we can see the various pigments. I believe this is spinach. And so you can see the chlorophyll in this line right here, chlorophyll B. You can see chlorophyll A right here. You can see some other colors though too. So you have other pigments like xanthophyll, which is located here. It's more orange. And at the very top, one of the lighter pigments is carotene. So chlorophyll absorbs only red, blue, and violet light. Chlorophyll B absorbs colors or light energy not absorbed by chlorophyll A. But chlorophyll B transfers the light energy to chlorophyll A in the light reactions. And we have other pigments that include yellow, oranges, and reds, and they collect some of the other wavelengths. So what this is an absorption of light by chloroplasts. And what we can see on here is that most of the light is being absorbed in these sort of color wavelengths. So in the purples and blues, notice that light absorption goes down in the greens and yellows, and it goes back up again here. Because remember right here, this is usually the color of the plant. Right? Plants are usually green. Photosynthetic plants are usually green, and so green is reflected. Therefore, it's not absorbed, so the energy is not absorbed by the plant to be used in photosynthesis at all. So here's a classic question of why leaves change color. So during the fall, green chlorophyll is reduced first. And when that becomes reduced, it reveals the carotenoid pigments. So you can see different trees have different prevalence of pigments. So there's some reds, there's some yellows, and it depends on the type of tree. So let's start in on photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is not simple. It's a lot of biochemical pathways and steps. It's a very complex reaction, but we're going to break it down into two reaction systems. We have our light-dependent reactions, and we have our light-independent, or I'm going to refer to them as our dark reactions. Okay? So let's look at the light reactions first. Within the light reaction, water is used to produce oxygen, ATP, and this right here, NADPH. NADPH is, if it looks like NADH, it's an electron carrier. So water is split, giving off oxygen. It depends on sunlight, so we need sunlight in order for this to work. This is the activation energy. The light is absorbed by the pigments, and the pigments become excited. Now the electrons found on chlorophyll will then be transferred along a pathway through a series of carriers, and the end product is some ATP produced and some NADPH. Now this takes place within the thylakoid membrane. So this diagram here is on the light reactions. So light energy comes in and strikes the thylakoids, and this is just a blow up of that thylakoid membrane right here. And you can see that there's various proteins along the pathway, and when that light energy strikes the chlorophyll in these photosystems, the electrons become excited and they begin to travel. Now that traveling does a couple things. It produces some NADPH, and also with the process we get ATP production. Now what do we use that ATP and that NADPH for? Well, they go into the dark reaction. So this is where CO2 comes in. So carbon dioxide is used with ATP and NADPH to produce glucose or sugars. The system depends on products from the light reaction, but it doesn't require light energy. And this is why it's called the dark reactions or the light independent. It includes a cycle known as the Calvin cycle, which we'll look at in a second. It takes place in the stroma, and this is actually what we call carbon fixation. So carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is bonded to organic compounds, and those organic compounds, remember, are things like glucose. And we use ATP and NADPH for this process. So this diagram here shows us an overview of photosynthesis. Light energy coming in from the light reactions produces ATP and NADPH, gives off oxygen as a waste, and needs water in order for it to work. The ATP and the NADPH go into the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle is very similar to the Krebs in that it's a cyclical series of reactions, uses CO2, right? That's that carbon fixation, uses the ATP and the NADPH to produce glucose. Okay, the byproducts of the Calvin cycle on top of glucose is NADP plus, which will then go and pick up a light or electrons in the light reaction, plus ADP, which will then go back to the light reaction to become ATP, and the cycle continues. So that concludes our podcast on photosynthesis, and I hope that was helpful.